So this is a new VR game that I am working on. So this is the model for a giant boss fight that I am working on, and I'm going to talk about it more, but he is made out of all real animal bones. I think these are mostly all deer bones that I found in my yard while I was mowing the lawn out in the country here, and I use a technique called photogrammetry to scan all of these bones into the game and turn it into this giant monster. So you might be asking, what kind of gameplay is there going to be to fight this giant monster? Well, it's going to be kind of like an evolution of my previous game, Jet Island, which is out on Steam right now, but it's going to involve a lot of swinging around on hook shots and parkour and have really realistic, tight movement physics controls in the game. And unlike Jet Island, where there was like laser guns that is your main weapon, I'm thinking the main weapon in this game is going to be swords. Hey everyone, how's it going? My name's Erica, and welcome to the Master Indie YouTube channel. So, one thing I want to say real quick is just a huge thank you for all of the overwhelmingly positive comments on my previous video, and also thank you for helping me double the number of subscribers in just 24 hours on my new tutorial channel if you want to learn how to make your own video games. Alright, let's get back to the video and show you this game I'm working on. So like I mentioned earlier, this monster is made out of a technique called photogrammetry. So in most video games, all of the characters are created from 3D models that are modeled by hand in a program like Blender or 3ds Max or something like that. Whereas this monster was created in real life. So I actually made all of these individual parts. So like this right here, I took a deer jawbone and I covered it in red paint, and I took some twine and I tied a rusty spring from an old tractor and some rusty nails. And then I took it out to the barn and set up some photography lighting, and I took high resolution pictures of this object like 100, some of these pieces 200, 300 times from every single angle, like just like 360 degrees, top, bottom, just like so many pictures of the same object. And then I take all of those and I put them into the computer, and I use a program that stitches them all together and creates a super highly detailed 3D object. And I wanted to make sure that I got a really high resolution camera and to get just as much freaking detail as I possibly could get into one character. Like, for example, one of these fingers probably has more detail in it than most of your average video game characters, because he's like the size of a skyscraper. He's just absolutely gigantic, and you're going to be swinging from him and climbing on him. So, and there's just going to be like, kind of Shadows of the Colossus style, where you're fighting one gigantic boss fight at a time. So I can pack in all of this detail into one character, because there aren't like hundreds of characters on the screen at one time. You just have your environment and the boss fight. So I'm actually breaking a lot of photogrammetry rules for making this game. So a couple of rules that I've heard when you're supposed to be doing 3D scans is you're supposed to limit the amount of details for video games. Like when you have too much detail, they consider that more like cinema quality. And they say that you don't really need like that much detail to make it look realistic. Well, since my character is the freaking size of a skyscraper, I wanted as much detail as possible. And it's interesting because these objects are, not that big. Like this leg bone right here, I would say is probably like a foot long in real life, but it's going to be like 200 feet long in the game. So I have to just pack in as much detail as I possibly can get the computer to render. Another thing that I heard that you're supposed to do with photogrammetry is not make your objects too unique. And I think that mostly applies to environmental objects or any kind of objects that you plan on repeating. So I've kind of accidentally discovered a new style just because as an indie game developer, I'm just one person, so I have to get creative and try to figure out how to make my work go farther. So from what I've heard, you're supposed to make objects simple and not have like too many unique shapes to them. Otherwise the player is going to see, like, for an example, like a tree or something. So if they see the same tree twice, that's going to like break their immersion. But if it's a really like simple looking tree, they're not going to really notice, like they're only going to really notice like unique features and stuff like that. So what I've figured out is for this giant boss fight, As you can maybe tell, this bone right here and this bone right here are actually the same bone. And there's actually a lot of repeating going on this guy to try to make the models that I made go farther and to be able to copy and paste things. But you don't really notice because they're so chaotic. There's like so much detail and so much uniqueness that your eyes just get kind of overwhelmed. And then plus with all of the lighting and the movement, well, once I show the gameplay of the swinging around and stuff, like you're just not going to be able to tell that there's too much repeating going on. Like you might notice that this hand, and let me fly over to it, and this hand look the same. Actually, you can't even really tell. Okay, from that angle you can tell. So yeah, it's kind of hard to see where all of these different objects repeat because they're just so chaotic. I really didn't have too much of a plan when I started making this guy. I just had a pile of bones that had been sitting out in nature for a while, so they're really dirty. Like some of them have like some green moss on them and stuff and some dirt. And then I splashed red paint on it, on one of like the teeth and stuff like that. It's like, whoa, that looks really cool. So I started doing that on more of the bones. And then I found some twine and some old nails and started tying them to that. I think this object over here has like more objects like tied up together, so it's like creating this really like uneasy, weird, inhuman, demonic look to the game. Like here's like a jawbone tied to a spinal cord, and that's his arm. So this game's just like really messed up and sick and twisted. The more I worked on this game, the more so in real life, I have a table sitting out in the barn and I have all of these animal bones with like nails and blood on them and stuff like that. And they're just like sitting out there all scattered on a table. And like, once I started putting all this together, I looked at it all and I was just like, did I go too far? Like, is this too much? Like, I look like I'm gonna cast an evil spell or something. Like, what if one of my neighbors walks into this barn and sees what's spread out on this table? Like, they're gonna call an exorcist or something. Like, I just feel like I almost went too far. And then, like, I actually look in the game and see what it looks like, and it's just, like, so freaking unsettlingly terrifying. I'm not so sure how I feel about these eyes though. They're supposed to look like they're on fire and they're supposed to go along with the lighting system, but I think the eyes need some work. Let me turn off the lighting system so that you can see it without any obstruction. So yeah, there's just like so much detail, and it's so cool using real animal bones because you get so much detail that I just wouldn't, even if I was a good artist, I wouldn't think to add all of these things to the character. A lot of this stuff kind of accidentally happens and naturally happens, and you just get like just this like big sense of realism and unsettlingly realistic look to the game. Like it's almost like kind of like uncanny valley in a really terrifying way. So I really hope the fact that this stuff is like actually real adds like a grittiness to the game that really makes the players feel just absolutely terrified when they see this thing stomping around in the world. I've had a couple people ask me how tall this boss is going to be. And I can scale him up and down. I think it's going to really come down to gameplay, and as I add more boss fights into the game, I'm going to keep making him bigger and bigger. But if you've played my previous game, Jet Island, you probably know the kind of scale of boss fights that I like to make. Like, some of those boss fights are probably like 500 feet tall. I know the final boss in the game is kind of like a worm snake guy, and I measured it, and he's 3.5 miles long. Like, just absolutely gigantic. I think VR is a really fun place to play with movement and scale, and I really want to take the gameplay style of Jet Island to the next level and really combine it with a completely new graphic style. Alright, I think that's everything I want to show off in this video. One of the next steps that I'm going to need to work on for this giant boss fight is a active ragdoll system, which basically means that as he starts walking around and being animated, he's going to have physics. So like when it punches something, something or its foot stomps on the ground, it's going to physically collide with those things. I want him to be able to smack his hand into buildings and actually like knock a building over with like real physics. So I almost have that working. The only problem is when I start the game, his head just starts spinning in circles. So there's something wrong with the code. I have a hunch as to what's wrong, so I'm going to go and work on that before I try showing it off. So yeah, that's going to be really cool when I do show that off. So I guess until my next video, I will see you later and keep making games.